So welcome to session 5 in this business ethics tutorial, and my congratulations if you made it this far. But I think the best part is yet to come. We're going to look at some business case studies, 6 of them, 3 in this session and 3 more in the last. So in this one, I want to begin with the subprime mortgage crisis, and then we're going to move on to 2 others, one involving a dilemma of one of my MBA students, and finally the issue of marketing Prozac. This is not intended to be the final word, the final analysis. I'm only giving you the first pass of an analysis to show you what ethical reasoning looks like. All of these cases deserve closer study. This is only the beginning. Okay, Countrywide Financial. In 2007, Countrywide Financial was the largest mortgage lender in the U.S. A year later, they were gone. They issued about 9% of their portfolio in subprime mortgage loans. This is compared to about 20% nationwide. A subprime loan, of course, is one in which the borrower is somewhat risky, doesn't meet the usual standards for a mortgage loan, and as a result, the interest rates are higher. Things were going fine until 2008. In late 2008, there was a global credit freeze we all know about. We're all still suffering from the consequences of that debacle. And subprime loans played a role in this. The banks would make the loan and then sell them to someone else who would repackage these loans into a mortgage-backed security. And those securities were sold around the world. They somehow received AAA ratings from the ratings agencies. And as a result, banks, even in Europe and elsewhere, were buying these things. But when the crisis started, they were poison. Everyone was trying to get rid of them. No one would give credit. In the meantime, there were the credit default swaps, which supposedly were to give some security to people who bought mortgage-backed instruments. At that time, there were actually $62 trillion worth of credit default swaps outstanding. That's about equal to world GDP. What happened to Countrywide? Well, back in 2007, the CEO complained that there was really too much anxiety over this mortgage thing. It really wasn't that serious a problem, particularly for his company, which was below the average in subprime portfolio. Nonetheless, by July 2008, the company had sold out to Bank of America for 1/6 of its value a year earlier. Okay, how about subprime loans? Is there anything wrong with a subprime loan? Well, they have a legitimate purpose. The purpose is, well, if you have a customer who wants to buy a house, who had some bad luck in the past, this is a way to get back on a good footing, okay? To be forgiven, to prove you have a reliable credit record even though the past looks a little iffy. However, in the 2000s, this got out of hand. A lot of borrowers were lured into risky propositions. One of the favorite loans was the so-called 228 loan. That means for 2 years the interest rates would be low and you can afford the house payments. But in the 3rd year, the interest rates go up. What are you going to do then? Well, maybe you'll be better off. Maybe your house value will have increased because everything's going up and you can refinance if necessary. In addition to those, there were a lot of adjustable rate mortgages going around. Everyone was assuming that house values would continue to rise. But there was something else going on. Because these mortgages were being securitized, that is, sold off to banks to be packaged into securities, there was no longer an incentive to perform due diligence on these mortgage loans. And some of the lenders were not, particularly in the subprime segment. In the absence of this incentive, well, some of these loans simply were too risky. Well, all of this phenomenon contributed to a bubble in house prices, and as bubbles always do, it burst in late 2006. The house values went down. Many homeowners were underwater, meaning that the principal value of their mortgage was greater than the value of their house. And banks began to foreclose. And the rest is a sordid history. The issue before us, issue number 1 at least, when is making a subprime loan an ethical thing to do? In a few minutes, I'll look at the issue of, do you foreclose on those guys? Well, let's look at the utilitarian test first. Now, I'm going to assume that at the time, people could reasonably believe this was a good risk. Everyone seemed genuinely to believe and perhaps had some evidence that house prices would not crash. And if that's so, perhaps on the average, the utility of making a loan like this was positive, the net utility. So I'm going to suppose people are going to come out ahead on this. I'll assume that so that we pass the test. But that brings us to the generalization test, because even if the expected return for both borrower and lender is positive, there's a lot of downside risk just the same. Things can go sour, and of course they did. Now, to make this a little easier, I'm going to suppose that the lender is providing full disclosure about the terms of the loan. Everyone understands the terms of the loan, everyone understands the interest rates are going to go up, and so forth. However, despite that, the lender knows that the borrower is underestimating the risk. You know, they really want that house. This is their chance. The bank is willing to go along with it. They're just simply not aware of all the factors. And in particular, the borrower is not aware that the lender no longer has an incentive to do due diligence on the loan. They're thinking the bank's going to check this thing out carefully, because banks have always done that. But they're not checking it out carefully because they don't have that incentive. The borrower doesn't know that, and the lender knows the borrower doesn't know that. Okay, so that's the situation before us. Okay, now, can we simply say, caveat emptor, right? These are adults. They want to buy a house. They should check out the risk and be responsible for themselves. When can you say caveat emptor? It's a fundamental issue in business. This comes up all the time. Business as we know it requires some degree of trust between the buyer and the seller. If you go into Kmart, you go into the grocery, you can't research every item you put in your shopping basket. You have to trust the seller to give you what you expect. Now, of course, regulation can help here. We can have labeling laws and such things. But as we've discussed before, regulation can't succeed if the business world in general is not ethical enough to go along with this. So we simply have to trust people to give us what we expect. Otherwise, commerce as we know it is simply not possible. So how much trust do we need? So I think the generalization principle says here that the seller his actions are ungeneralizable if they presuppose a level of trust that would not exist if all sellers behaved the same way. Got that? Okay? So you're not being ethical if you're presupposing a level of trust in the system that would not exist if everyone were like you. That's the rule. Okay, so Countrywide, for example, was probably presupposing that the borrowers would not question the due diligence of the banks. Okay, they were probably presupposing that people trust the banks, you check out this loan carefully before they make it. And that doesn't generalize, right? Because if it becomes standard practice, if banks are never checking out these loans carefully enough because they're going to sell them off, then the borrowers are going to know about that. They're going to be alerted to it. They're going to be onto it, and they're going to be more careful. In fact, that's exactly what happened. It didn't generalize. The system fell apart. Okay. What's the conclusion? At a minimum, to pass the generalization test, the lender has to make sure that the borrower is fully apprised of the risk, in addition to the terms of the loan, and in particular, that the borrower knows the system has changed now, that the lender is going to sell off this loan and doesn't necessarily have to check it out carefully because someone else is going to assume the risk. Okay, so we've looked at the issue of making a subprime loan, which was problematic at the time. How about foreclosing on the guys after you've made the loan? Okay, the interest rates go up, the house value goes down, they can't make the payments. Now what do? Now I'm going to assume here there was no actual fraud or misrepresentation in making the loan. Okay, so if you make a loan, if you make a contract and there's fraud and misrepresentation, then legally you can void that contract. Okay, but it's not that easy here. Everything the lender said was true. The terms of the contract were understood. It's just that the borrower didn't fully understand the risk, and the lender didn't apprise him of that risk, okay, which is another issue. So this is what's going on. Now, given that, is it okay to go in and foreclose when the borrower can't make the payments? Well, let's look at the utilitarian test here. Probably renegotiating this loan, perhaps reducing the interest payments or reducing the principal, probably that benefits both borrower and lender, at least in many cases. Because if you have to foreclose, that's expensive. Maybe you can't dump this house. There's a lot of risk involved in that. Given that, the lender should renegotiate for the sake of the utilitarian principle, unless that would be unethical for some other reason. People always bring up this issue of moral hazard, and perhaps that's why it's not ethical to renegotiate. Because if everyone renegotiates whenever a borrower gets in trouble, then borrowers will have no incentive to be careful about which loans they take out. So that's the classical argument for moral hazard. That sounds like a generalization test, doesn't it? Well, suppose everyone did this, but it's not quite right. It's not quite the right analysis. Let me try to explain what is the right analysis. Now, if both parties benefit, then probably this is generalizable, right? Because basically they both have an incentive to renegotiate the contract. Now, suppose people who have a contract and both would benefit from renegotiating the contract do so on a regular basis. Very often they do so already. So that's probably generalizable if both parties benefit. So I think we can conclude that if the lender would benefit from renegotiation as well as the borrower, then there's a utilitarian obligation to do so, and it's generalizable too. So go out there and renegotiate. Now, if the lender does not benefit from renegotiation, you have to think about why would he renegotiate? Well, I guess the reason for renegotiating is to avoid the disutility of the foreclosure. Moral hazard isn't quite the problem here, because if lenders were always willing to adjust the terms when people get in trouble, the system would adjust to that. If I get into trouble, they're going to ease up on the interest rate. If that's a common practice, then the lenders would tighten up the conditions when they make the loan because they know they may have to ease up later. So the whole system could adjust. So the moral hazard argument is not quite right. What you've got to do is to consider the lender's purpose in renegotiating, and that purpose is to avoid a foreclosure. Okay. Now, if all the lenders were to ease up when people are in trouble and tighten up initially to account for that, that would not necessarily avoid foreclosures, right? Because basically the same number of people would be getting in trouble, because in the end the terms of the loan are the same. Okay. So probably if the purpose is to avoid foreclosure, then it's not generalizable. So what's the conclusion? If renegotiation benefits the lender, you got to do it. You have an obligation to do it. If it doesn't benefit the lender, you shouldn't do it. Not because of moral hazard, but because it's not generalizable. All right. Now, public policy issues are something else. Maybe the government should step in and incentivize lenders to renegotiate, as it has done. Okay, that's another issue. Okay, and perhaps even if the government simply is trying to encourage, through jawboning, encourage the lenders to renegotiate, perhaps they should in that case. That gives another reason to do so. But I didn't look at those issues. I'd like to move on now to a case I received from one of my MBA students. So this was a guy who said that he was working for a bank, a financial institution, and this bank gives financial advice to its customers about how to invest. Well, the bank itself has some investment products like mutual funds, and naturally the bank would be pleased if its customers would buy its own mutual funds, right? There's sort of an incentive there to push its own financial products. This student was caught in that situation. So his job was to write up this report to send to their customers, and the report contains some information on the performance of the bank's mutual funds. And of course the bank wants these funds to look good. Now, this is not a legal filing, it's not an SEC report, it's just a report to their customers. The boss called this guy into the office. No one else was around, and it's usually like this. Okay, so when the student wrote up the case, he was careful to say it was a one-on-one conversation. There's no paper trail, there's no email, one-on-one. And the boss says, you know what, one of our mutual funds is a real dog, it's not performing well. Why don't you just leave that one out? Just don't talk about that one. Talk about the others. And no problem here, everything you put in that report will be true. You just leave out the bad news. Okay? Besides, we have a fiduciary duty to our stockholders, right? It's our duty to come in here and maximize the bank's return, and this will help us. Now, as far as fiduciary duty goes, I talked about that. The prior question is always, if the owners of the company were in the office, if the stockholders were sitting there at that desk, what should they do about this situation? Should they leave the numbers out? So I'm going to look at that issue. Okay, that's the prior issue. We can talk about fiduciary duty later. We've got to get this prior issue down first. So there's two issues actually here. First, is there anything wrong with leaving out this bad number? And number two, if there is something wrong about it, what's the guy supposed to do when his boss is giving him an order to leave it out? Okay, there's two different issues there, and you got to deal with both of them. The second one, of course, is quite hard. Well, the first part is easy. Is it wrong to omit the numbers? Well, it's deceptive. Like I used the example of the doctor. He sends me the report. It leaves out the bad news. That's deceptive because I would expect the doctor to tell me all the news. And I guess the whole point of this, we're leaving out the numbers because we want to deceive our customers about how the funds are doing. Okay. And in fact, you can try to generalize this. Suppose that financial institutions always omitted bad news from their reports. Then what would their customers do? They'd throw the reports in the trash, right? Because they know it's all fluff. Okay, so it's not generalizable. Now, given that it's unethical to leave out this number, what am I supposed to do about it? The boss has told me to leave it out. I mean, how high a price am I supposed to pay to be ethical? Am I supposed to sacrifice my job because of one little number? Okay, suppose the boss is saying, if you don't leave this number out, I'm going to beat up your family. That has happened many times in history. And that seems a little bit ridiculous. So there seems to be some limit to what I have to do to be honest here. What is that limit? Okay, what kind of price? Well, we're going to try to address that. It's not easy. I'll do my best. From the utilitarian point of view, the first thing I do, try to compromise. Boss, why don't we just show the average performance? Or why don't we put a footnote that says, well, this fund was some special circumstances, that's why it's so low. That makes everyone better off. Compromise. But perhaps the boss, digs in, he won't compromise. What are the consequences if I refuse to go along with the boss? Who knows? The boss may respect me for this, or the boss may give me a negative performance review next year. And when the next reduction in force, my job goes first. Who knows? On the other hand, suppose I go along with the boss. Well, this may get around. People may find out I did something dishonest. It may destroy my reputation. It's not only bad for me, but it's bad for the world, right? Because if I can't keep my job, I can't go out there and make a contribution. So I think we have to say utilitarian test. It's just impossible to say, therefore you pass it. Now there's another argument that people use. It's a really important one. I could say, if I don't do it, someone else will. If I don't do what the boss says, he'll just transfer me somewhere else and get the next lackey to come in and do it for him. The result will be the same. Is that a good argument? Suppose you're a prison guard at Abu Ghraib in Iraq, and your commanding officer says, I want you to hook up those electric wires and torture those prisoners. If I don't do it, he'll get someone else to do it. Is that a good argument? Okay, we got to deal with that. It's a serious one. Actually, the resolution is fairly simple. It's a good utilitarian argument. Okay, you can pass the utilitarian test that way. If the results are the same or worse, if someone else does it, then I'm maximizing utility. You pass that test. Okay, so at best, the someone else would do it argument allows me to pass the utilitarian test. But you've got to satisfy the other tests too. For example, torturing prisoners is a violation of autonomy. Okay, it's unethical for that reason. Okay. So maybe I passed utilitarian test. We'll grant that. But we've got to go on to the other tests. Now, what I'm doing here is to obey the boss. Is that ethical? Does it generalize? Well, I suppose that everyone who could keep their job and stay out of trouble by obeying the boss did so. Suppose people always caved into the boss like this. Would they still be able to accomplish their purpose? Would they still be able to stay out of trouble and keep their job if they caved into the boss? Maybe so. Think of the guys who worked for the Stasi in East Germany. They did what the boss said, right? They always caved into the boss, said, yes, sir. They kept their jobs, at least until the wall fell, at least for a while. So maybe it is generalizable. I can't really say it's not. The catch here is we're not just obeying the boss, we're obeying the boss by deceiving our clients. Okay, now suppose that people were always willing to deceive clients whenever the boss said. They'd always cave in. There would be a very strong temptation for the boss to ask people to do that, right? This is why the boss is doing this in private. He wants plausible deniability. He wants someone else to do the dirty work. This is the way it usually happens with new employees, right? New employees not quite sure what the norms are, so the boss says, well, you take care of this, but no one else knows what's going on. So the boss can keep his hands clean. Well, if bosses can always keep their hands clean and get someone else to do these things, that's a strong temptation, and maybe it would become very prevalent, so the customers would no longer believe the company because they know what's going on in these companies. It always happens. It's always that way. In fact, it's sort of interesting that bosses don't ask us to do that more often than they do, isn't it? Okay. It's sort of interesting. It could be a lot worse than it is. Why isn't it? Well, I think it's because the employees would resist. Okay? They wouldn't put up with this, at least because the good ones would resist. Now, maybe the company doesn't care if the mediocre employees resist, but they don't want to lose their good people. This is one reason to be good at what you do. You don't have to compromise because they want to keep you. Okay? So I think this is not generalizable. That's my call, because it would be such a strong temptation. People would no longer be credible because they're going along with what their bosses tell them, to deceive customers and so forth. Now, suppose the threat is much stronger than simply a bad performance evaluation. Suppose that they're going to beat up your family or whatever if you don't go along with what the company says. Then is it generalizable to go along with the boss with a very severe outcome? Well, probably it is, because it's already generalized. Even now, practically everyone is willing to leave out a bad number if the consequence is your family's going to suffer. It's already generalized, and despite that fact, bosses don't ask us to do that. They don't put us in that position, probably because they get in trouble themselves. Okay, we get back to them. So it's already generalized, and therefore it's generalizable. Okay, so the conclusion here is that, well, there is a limit as to how far you have to go, and the generalization test basically tells us what that limit is, at least, more or less. There is a virtue issue here, other than the fact that deception is dishonorable. Okay, there's a virtue of being honest. If your family's health is at stake, or perhaps you have a huge expense burden, perhaps you have a disabled child who has enormous expense, or your parents are being cared for, and you just can't afford to lose your job right now. You have to make a compromise. Okay, there you have a conflict of virtues. Okay, ordinarily, if there's nothing else at stake, you would say, I have to be honorable about this. I just can't work for this company if this keeps up. But if there's another virtue at stake, like loyalty to your family, well then, yeah, the virtue test sort of drops out of the picture because you have a conflict of virtues. Also, there's a professional issue. As a professional, I'm a financial advisor. I exist, I'm here to give financial advice to my clients, and now I'm misleading my clients. So that's contrary to who I am in my career. So if I have to keep this up for this company, for this boss, I just have to get out of there because it's not consistent with who I am. Okay, that's how the virtue test applies here. So here's my scorecard. We're failing 2 of the tests and passing 1. Okay. My last case in this session is a marketing case. It's about Prozac, the antidepressant. Okay, it's a drug that's sold by Eli Lilly. What is Prozac? It's a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Okay, so serotonin is a neurotransmitter that I understand makes you feel good. It prevents you from going into depression. And if you don't have enough of this stuff in your brain, well, you start to feel depressed. Prozac prevents the neurons from reabsorbing the serotonin at the same rate. Now, depression is no joke, right? It's a serious, debilitating illness, and Prozac was introduced as a breakthrough in this field, primarily because it had less side effects than its predecessors. When it came out, there was an enormous marketing buzz about Prozac. Even a book came out about it. Was it Listening to Prozac or something like that? It seemed like everyone wanted Prozac. Well, there's a couple of issues here. One is the marketing strategy of the company. Pull marketing is marketing in which you try to induce the customer to go to the physician and ask for a prescription. Now, the company was also pushing the product on the physicians, right? A very intense advertising campaign for physicians. But at the same time, it was sending ads out there in the general public to induce people to go to the physician and pressure the doctor to give them a prescription for the stuff that makes you feel good. Is there anything wrong with doing this, with pull marketing? It is controversial. although it's a big business. There's about $2.5 billion a year spent by the pharmaceutical companies on pull marketing. Okay. And secondly, there's some psychological persuasion in these ads. You know, you can be the life of the party. You can feel good about yourself. You can be an extrovert. If you're on Prozac, you're no longer going to be that shy, withdrawn, uncomfortable person. You're going to be out there as successful. Is that okay to sort of work on people psychologically? I'm going to try to look at that one too. All right. So what's the problem with Prozac? Well, you know, it's not all roses. It takes a long time for this stuff to start working. It takes several weeks. Okay, it may not work. It can have side effects, although perhaps not as bad as its predecessors. Actually, apparently, it's no more effective than the other drugs. Okay, it creates dependency. You know, you have to go off it very slowly. And it's not intended to make you an extrovert, okay, or life of the party. It's intended to treat clinical depression. All right. Now, let's look at the pull marketing. The utilitarian test here is probably the key one. Are we doing any damage out there by encouraging patients to go to their doctors? Now, perhaps the doctor should not give in to this kind of pressure. Perhaps they should stand their ground and say, you don't need that stuff. Perhaps so, but that's another issue. That's not the issue I'm looking at right now. I'm looking at what the company's doing in the way of its advertising. Too much aggressive pull marketing can lead to abuse of a drug. In the case of Prozac, well, you know, a lot of people with depression don't realize or didn't realize it can be treated. They may not even realize that they have this disease. It's not a well understood disease in the public. So one might make a case that actually pull marketing benefits people with depression to a great degree, to a degree that outweighs any abuse that may result from the drug. Okay. At least, given the evidence we have, let's grant that. At least we can't be irrational. We're not irrational in believing that we actually increase utility with an aggressive marketing campaign, because we bring help to all these people who don't know it's available. So we'll grant that we passed this test. It's probably the key test for this case. That brings us to the other issue, and that's the psychological persuasion. Okay. Is it okay to manipulate people psychologically? Now, the advertising people who talk to me about this say, of course, what do you think advertising is for? You know, you're working on people psychologically. But actually, it's not so simple. Particularly in the Western ethical tradition, we had this idea of autonomy. Remember that? We talked about that. Okay? So suppose, for example, they put something in the water to make us buy Prozac. You know, it works on us. It makes us crave this stuff. Is that ethical? Or we say, oh, no, we shouldn't do that. Okay. Well, of course, partly because it's deceptive, right? They're not telling us it's in the water. Okay. We're being deceived about what we're drinking. But that's not the whole problem. Part of the problem is that it's circumventing our rational faculties. And that's a denial of an autonomous decision-making process. Now, you may say, you ethics guys are sort of spoiling all the fun in life. Think about seduction. You want to seduce your lover. Doesn't that work on someone's emotions? Aren't you circumventing the rational process there? You guys just won't let us have any fun. Actually, no, right? Because in seduction, at least when it's going right, both parties know what's going on, right? So you're being seduced, you intentionally give into it, right? That's what makes it fun. That's what makes it interesting. There's this sort of, you're on the borderline here. You know, if you're doing seduction and the other party doesn't know what's going on, well, that's no fun at all. At least it shouldn't be. So I'm not saying you shouldn't have any fun. I'm saying that, you know, you can appeal to emotions, fine, but not in a way that circumvents or nullifies the rational faculty, you know, decision-making faculty. So psychological persuasion can be fine if you're simply appealing to emotions. For example, if you're trying to sell this convertible sports car, you know, you want to give people the idea, some idea of what it's like. You know, you're out there on the road, you know, the wind is through your hair, you get the feeling of freedom. That's an emotional reaction, and you have to know about that before you can decide rationally whether you want a sports car. Okay, so the emotions can be relevant to your decision. Or suppose you're a UNICEF person who's putting up an ad here to encourage people to give to some relief agency to relieve hunger, and you put these horrible photos, you know, of children who are suffering from hunger. You know, you have an emotional reaction. Well, you know, you can't decide whether you should give until you understand at an emotional level what poverty is like. It's horrible. You've got to understand that. And then you can make a rational choice. Okay, so appeal to emotions can be perfectly fine. But if you're appealing an emotion in such a way that prevents you from making that rational choice, it gets in your way, then we got a problem. So Prozac ad, fine. If you want to show people, who are at the party and they're gushy and extroverted, that's fine, because you have to know what it's like to be that way, as long as you're also giving the downside and the side effects and so forth and so on. But if you're appealing to someone's sense of insecurity or whatever, some psychological problem so that they crave it without really making a rational choice as to whether it's the right treatment for them, then that's a problem. Okay, that's an advertising problem. So that's how I deal with the Prozac case. Now there is an issue here of temptation. Even if you're not manipulating people, you're perhaps tempting people to go get this drug or talk to the doctor about it. Is temptation okay? For example, if you sit down, at a restaurant, at the table, they're going to have these photos of luscious chocolate cake you have to look at while you're eating. Right? They're tempting you to order that stuff. Is that okay? Is anything wrong with that? Well, it's not denial of autonomy. You can still decide whether you want to eat that chocolate cake. It just is harder to decide now. It's harder to do it, but you can still decide. So basically the test with temptation is a utilitarian test. Yielding to a temptation now and then is fine. You love it. You think it's enjoyable, as long as it doesn't get out of hand. So if temptation has a positive effect, it's fine. It's too bad they can't tempt us to eat broccoli, isn't it? So temptation is not necessarily wrong, just depends on the outcome. Okay. We've already granted that the Prozac ads passed the utility test. Okay, so that's my analysis of Prozac. Next time, I have 3 more case studies for you. So see you then.